She was worth $3 billion. He had exactly $11 left in his wallet. They were both alone on the worst night of their lives, and neither of them knew who the other really was. What happened inside that laundromat after midnight would unravel a corporate conspiracy, shatter two carefully built walls, and force them both to choose between the life they were surviving and the life they actually deserved. If you've ever had to be strong for someone else when you were completely falling apart inside, this story is for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast. 1 hour it was overcast, clouds stacking low and gray over the downtown skyline, and the next it was a full-on downpour. The kind that hits Chicago in late October and makes you feel like the city is trying to wash itself clean of something it's ashamed of. Rain hammered the sidewalks. Gutters overflowed. The traffic signals on Kedzie Avenue swayed in the wind like they were reconsidering their life choices. Landon Hayes drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel of his 2009 Ford F-150, the truck making that grinding noise near the front axle that he'd been ignoring for 3 weeks because he didn't have the $300 to fix it. The wipers were working overtime. The defroster barely functioned. He had to keep reaching up to wipe a circle of fog off the inside of the windshield just to see the road. In the back seat, wrapped in her purple dinosaur blanket, Mia was asleep. She'd fallen asleep somewhere between their apartment and the pharmacy, one small fist balled against her cheek, her mouth slightly open. 8 years old, and she could sleep through anything. Through her father's worried silences, through the engine grinding, through the rain beating against the windows like it had a complaint to file. She had her mother's ability to find rest in the middle of chaos, and Landon had spent years being both grateful for it and quietly wrecked by the reminder. He'd already been to 2 pharmacies. The first was closed. A paper sign in the window said, "Closed for emergency repairs," which told him nothing useful. The second was open, but had a computer system issue and couldn't process his insurance card. The woman behind the counter had looked genuinely apologetic. Landon had nodded, taken the prescription slip back, and gotten in his truck without saying what was actually moving through his head. I was running out of time and options, which was a feeling he'd gotten very familiar with over the last 2 years. Mia had been running a fever since Tuesday. It had climbed to 103.4 that afternoon, which was the number that made Landon's hands go cold. He'd called her pediatrician from a job site in Wicker Park, standing on scaffolding 4 stories up in the wind, getting the details of the prescription over a phone call he had to take twice because the first time the connection dropped. The doctor said it was a bacterial infection, nothing life-threatening, but she needed the antibiotic tonight, or at least before morning. She needed to start the cycle. Landon found the 3rd pharmacy, an all-night place on West Division, just as the rain hit its worst. He double-parked, ran inside with Mia's prescription, and came back out 11 minutes later with a small white paper bag and $9.40 left in his wallet. The antibiotic had cost $27. He'd put $12 on his debit card and paid the rest in cash. And the debit card transaction had gone through, but he'd been watching the machine with his jaw tight the whole time, already doing the math in his head about what that meant for the electric bill that was due Friday. He sat in the truck for a second. Rain pounded the roof. The engine idled rough. He looked in the rear-view mirror at Mia. She was still asleep. Her fever had been up and down all day, and she'd been miserable, cranky in the morning, weepy by afternoon, eventually too exhausted to be either, just pale and quiet and hot to the touch. He'd given her children's ibuprofen before they left the apartment, but her fever was the stubborn kind. He needed to get her laundry done tonight because she didn't have clean pajamas. And a sick kid needed clean pajamas. That was just a fact he'd decided on, and the washing machine in their building had been broken since September. The landlord had promised to fix it by October 1st. It was now October 23rd. Landon pulled back onto Division Street and headed toward the laundromat on Milwaukee Avenue. Clark Street Wash was one of those laundromats that had probably looked cheerful when it was new. Yellow and white tiles, big front windows, rows of machines that hummed like they meant business. That had been sometime in the 90s, probably. Now the tiles were scuffed and cracked in places. A few of the fluorescent bulbs flickered, and the vending machine near the back had a handwritten note on it that said, "Hits hard, press gently," taped over the snack buttons. At 11:40 on a Thursday night in the middle of a rainstorm, the laundromat had exactly 2 people in it when Landon pushed through the door with Mia on his hip and a duffel bag over his shoulder. An older man in the far corner who was asleep in his chair with a newspaper draped over his chest, and a woman. Landon noticed the woman because she was standing in front of one of the front load washers with her arms crossed and an expression that looked like she was actively considering violence. She was maybe 30, black hair pulled back in what had probably been a neat ponytail at some point, but was now half fallen, strands of it loose around her face. She was wearing what looked like expensive jeans, the kind that are cut well and fall right, and a dark gray blazer over a simple top, and she had the kind of posture that said she was used to being the person in the room that other people adjusted themselves around. Even standing in a laundromat at midnight looking frustrated, she had that quality. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was more like she'd spent so long being looked at that she'd stopped noticing. Landon barely registered any of that. He was focused on finding an open machine that wasn't marked out of order. He laid Mia down across two plastic chairs near the back, tucking her dinosaur blanket around her and setting the paper pharmacy bag on the seat beside her. She stirred a little, murmured something, and went back to sleep. He pressed his palm flat against her forehead for a second. Still warm. He left the ibuprofen within reach in case she woke up. He started loading machines. He was sorting Mia's things into one washer. The pajamas first, then the rest of her clothes, because that was the priority. When he heard the woman behind him make a sharp sound of frustration. "Come on," she said, not to anyone in particular. "You have got to be kidding me." Landon glanced back. She was staring at the display panel on the washer in front of her, which was showing an error code. E4. He knew that one. "That one's drainage," he said. She turned and looked at him. Up close her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and she had the look of someone who'd been awake for a very long time and was functioning on caffeine and sheer determination. "Sorry?" "Error code E4 on these machines is a drainage issue. Water's not pumping out right. You want to move to one of the middle units. Those are newer. The two N1s on this row have been problems for a while." She looked back at the machine, then at him. "How do you know that?" "I've been coming here for 2 months." He went back to loading his washer. "Landlord." "Ah." She picked up her laundry bag, which was not a laundry bag, he noticed. It was actually a designer tote that she was using as a laundry bag, which was its own kind of interesting detail, and moved to a machine 2 down from his. "Thank you." "Sure." She loaded her machine without saying anything else. Landon finished loading Mia's things, put quarters in, and started the cycle. He checked on Mia again, still sleeping. He sat down in one of the plastic chairs near his machines and pulled out his phone. He had 3 emails from Marcus Webb's attorney. He stared at the preview text for a moment without opening them. Marcus Webb was the director of a company called Greystone Development, which had been trying to acquire the building that Landon's crew was contracted on. There was a legal dispute about permits and site access that had been dragging since August, and somewhere along the way it had gotten personal in ways Landon didn't fully understand yet. The emails had been getting more aggressive in tone. The last one, 2 days ago, had mentioned parental fitness in a sentence that had no reasonable business context to be in, and Landon had read it 3 times trying to understand what it was doing there before closing the app entirely. He closed the app now too. Not tonight. He looked up and found this woman watching him from across the row of machines. Not staring, more like she'd been looking somewhere unfocused, and he'd happened to be in that direction. "Sorry," she said when he caught her eye. "You have a kid with you?" "She's sick." He nodded toward Mia. "Needed her laundry done." The woman looked over at Mia, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was hard to name. Not pity. It wasn't that. More like recognition. "How old?" 8. He paused. "Almost 9. She'll tell you almost 9. The corner of her mouth moved. "What's wrong with her?" "Bacterial infection. I've got her antibiotic." He held up the pharmacy bag briefly. "She'll be fine." "You were out getting that tonight? In this?" He looked at her for a second, then back at his phone. "Yeah." She didn't say anything to that. The machines hummed. Rain hit the big windows in sheets. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. The old man in the corner shifted in his chair, the newspaper rustling against his chest. Landon sat with his phone, but he wasn't reading anything. He was running numbers in his head, which was a thing he did constantly and couldn't stop. The electric bill was $142 and due Friday. He had a check coming from the Wicker Park job on the 15th, which was the 15th, which was not Friday. His truck needed front axle work. Mia's field trip was in 2 weeks, and the permission slip had come home with a $20 fee. He put his phone in his pocket and looked at the ceiling for a while. The woman's washer beeped an error code again. Different one this time, E2, which was a load balance issue, which meant her laundry was bunched up on one side of the drum. He watched her stare at it without moving for a long moment. "You have to redistribute," he said. She turned. "What?" "Load balance error. Open it, move the clothes around so the weight's more even, then restart." She looked at the machine. "Does this laundromat have any functioning equipment?" "The dryers are mostly fine," he said. "It's the washers." She opened the machine, reached in with both hands, and started rearranging. She did it with the focused, slightly aggravated energy of someone who was used to dealing with high-stakes problems and was now applying that same intensity to wet laundry, which was absurd enough that Landon almost smiled. "There's a trick to it," he said. "Heavier stuff in the back, spread out. Lighter things kind of fill in around." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You know a lot about laundromats." "I know a lot about broken things." He stood and came over, looked at the drum without touching her laundry. "Try moving those jeans to the back. Yeah, there." She redistributed, closed the door, pressed restart. The machine thought about it for a few seconds, then began to turn. "Thank you," she said, and meant it this time. "Sure." He went back to his chair. She stayed standing near her machine for a moment, then instead of going back to her own side, she sat down in the chair across from him. "I'm Victoria," she said. He looked up. "Landon. Do you come here every week?" "Twice a week lately." He shrugged. "Building washer's been out since September." "That's insane." "Yeah, well." He looked at his hands. They had calluses along the palm and a faint cut on 2 knuckles that had mostly healed. Construction hands. His dad had had the same ones. "Welcome to renting." Victoria looked at her own hands for a second. They were smooth, a single thin ring on her right hand, nails that were trimmed short and clean. "I don't usually do my own laundry," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I mean, I'm not—" "That's not a brag," she said, and she looked momentarily embarrassed, which was the first unguarded thing she'd shown. "I have a service, I use a service, but I couldn't— Tonight felt like a night I needed to be doing something myself. Does that make sense?" "Not really," he said. "But also, yes." She laughed. It was short, a little surprised, and it was real, not a social laugh. "Fair. What happened tonight?" She looked at him, and he could see her deciding how much to say. "It was a long week," she said finally. "Very public, very— I needed to be somewhere that nobody was looking at me." "So you came to a laundromat." "So I came to a laundromat." She glanced around at the flickering fluorescence and the cracked tile and the sleeping man in the corner. "It's doing the job, honestly." "No one's going to bother you here," he agreed, "unless your washer breaks again." "Which it will." "Probably." They sat quietly for a moment. The rain kept coming. The machines hummed and turned. Mia made a small sound in her sleep, and Landon looked over at her immediately, but she just shifted under the blanket and settled again. "She's beautiful," Victoria said. "She's a nightmare," Landon said, but his voice went completely different when he said it, softer. All the flat tiredness fell out of it. "She's the funniest person I've ever met. She told her teacher last week that the class pet hamster looked like it had given up on life. The teacher had to leave the room." Victoria's face changed. Really changed, the kind of change people can't perform. "How long have you been doing this alone?" He looked at her. 3 years. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. People always said they were sorry, and it always put him in the position of having to reassure them, which was the exact opposite of what consolation was supposed to feel like. "Is it—" She stopped, reconsidered. "Is there a version of it that gets easier, or does it just get different?" "Different," he said. "Harder in new ways, easier in others." He looked at Mia again. She used to ask about her mom every night. Every single night, same question. I didn't know what to say, so I just told her the truth, which was that I didn't know all the answers, but she was loved and she was safe. He paused. She stopped asking as much. I don't know if that means it worked, or if it just means she stopped expecting an answer. Victoria was very still. Sorry, he said. That's a lot for a laundromat. No, she said quietly. Don't apologize for that. At some point, Landon got up to buy something from the vending machine. He stood in front of it for a second, reading prices, then put in $1.50 and got a pack of crackers. Victoria appeared beside him. The peanut butter ones are the least offensive, she said, pointing. I know, I got cheese. Bold choice. He pressed the button. The machine rattled and the pack dropped and he picked it up. You want something? She looked at the machine. I'll take whatever combination is least depressing. He looked at it seriously for a moment. B4, he said. Pretzels. They're the one thing in there that's still sort of what it claims to be. She put in $1.50 and pressed B4. The pretzels dropped. She picked them up, looked at them. You're right, pretzels. They stood there eating terrible vending machine food while the storm threw itself against the windows, and something shifted that was hard to define. It was the kind of shift that happens when two people stop being strangers out of necessity and start being something else out of choice. What do you do? She asked. Construction. Structural work, mostly. Some renovation. He finished a cracker. You? I work in business. She paused. Corporate. It's tedious to explain. He nodded. He didn't push on it. Do you like it? She asked. The construction. He thought about it, which was not what people usually did when someone asked what they did for work. They just answered. He thought first. I like building things that stand up, he said. There's a building on North Clark I worked on 4 years ago, and I drive past it sometimes, and it's just still there. That sounds simple, but it's not nothing. It's not nothing to put something in the world that stays. Victoria was looking at him like he'd said something she wasn't expecting. What? He said. Nothing. She looked away. That's just not how most people think about their work. How do most people think about it? Money, status, the next thing. She shook the pretzel bag slightly. Not that the thing stays. Well, he looked at the vending machine. Most people probably have work that's harder to see. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's probably true. They went back to their chairs. Around midnight and 30 minutes, Mia woke up. It was the way sick kids wake up. Disoriented, eyes glassy, that particular look of not understanding where they are or why everything feels wrong. She sat up and looked around the laundromat, and her face went immediately uncertain, the way it did when she was trying to figure out if this situation required crying. Hey. Landon was beside her in 4 steps. Hey, I'm right here. How do you feel? Hot, she said. Her voice was rough with sleep. Where are we? Doing laundry, remember? You fell asleep on the way here. She looked around. Her eyes landed on Victoria, who had very carefully not moved. Mia studied her for a long moment with the completely unfiltered assessment that 8-year-olds perform on adults. Who's that? Mia said. A person also doing laundry. Her name's Victoria. Mia looked at Victoria. Your hair is coming out. Victoria reached up and touched the side of her head. It is, she agreed. It's been a long night. Mia considered this. Mine does that too. I've heard that's a sign of resilience. Mia frowned. What's resilience? It means you're tough without meaning to be. Mia thought about this for a moment and then apparently decided she approved, because she pulled her blanket tighter and said, My stomach hurts. I know. Landon was already opening the pharmacy bag. I've got your medicine, okay? I need you to take it. Is it the liquid kind or the pill kind? Liquid. She made a face. It's grape flavored. She made a slightly smaller face. He got the dosing syringe and measured it out, and she took it the way she always took medicine, eyes closed, fast, like getting past something unpleasant. He watched her swallow and make the face again, and then settle back against the chairs. Can we go home soon? She asked. Soon. Laundry's almost done. My teacher says laundromats are where you go when the world isn't working right. Landon looked at her. Your teacher said that? I think she was talking about something else, but that's what I remember. Mia yawned, a full-body yawn that scrunched her entire face. She's probably fine. She has a dog. Victoria made a sound that was definitely a suppressed laugh. Landon glanced at her and she pressed her lips together very carefully. Mia's eyes were already closing again. Within 3 minutes, she was back under the blanket and mostly asleep. her breathing leveling out, the medicine beginning its work. Landon sat back down. He rubbed his face with both hands. He was exhausted in the specific way that comes from a day of being strong enough for someone else, that particular brand of tiredness that sits differently from physical fatigue. "You're good with her," Victoria said quietly. "I've got no idea what I'm doing," he said, just as quietly. "Yeah, but you show up." She looked at Mia. "That counts for more than knowing what you're doing." He looked at her. She was watching Mia, but her face had something in it that she wasn't saying, something personal, something she'd packed down. He didn't ask. Some things you don't ask in laundromats. The machines finished a little before 1 in the morning. They moved laundry to dryers, Landon first, then Victoria, working around each other in the natural rhythm. People develop when they share a small space long enough. He noticed she folded with the careful precision of someone who hadn't done it much but was determined to do it correctly. A perfect fold on a t-shirt, sharp corners, like it was a document. "You don't have to fold it that precisely," he said. "I know," she said, and kept folding precisely. He pulled Mia's pajamas out of the dryer warm and shook them out and held them for a moment. Still warm. That small, ordinary warmth felt important right now, though he couldn't have explained why. Victoria had been quiet for a while, doing her folding, and then she said without looking up, "What do you do when it's too much?" He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "Drive, mostly. Sometimes I just park somewhere and sit in the truck and don't think about anything specific." "Does that work?" "No." He set the pajamas aside. "But it's something to do instead of the other things." She nodded like she understood that completely. "I walk," she said. "At night, usually. My security team hates it." She stopped, caught herself on that last sentence. Landon looked at her. "I mean," she said. "Security team," he said. She looked at him. Her expression was the expression of someone who's been careful for a long time and just slipped, and now they're reading the room. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the dryer. "I'm not going to ask," he said. "You came here to be anonymous. That's fine. We're both just people doing laundry." She was quiet for a long beat. "Thank you," she said. "Sure." They didn't say much after that. The storm was starting to thin outside, the rain easing back from a roar to a steady sound. The old man in the corner woke up, checked his dryer, gathered his laundry in a large bag, and left without acknowledging either of them, which was perfect laundromat etiquette. Landon woke Mia gently when the laundry was done. She was limp and warm and complained about being moved, which he took as a good sign. She had enough energy to complain. He got her on his hip and her blanket wrapped around her, the duffel over his shoulder, and turned to say something to Victoria. She was standing near the door with her bag. She had a look on her face that he'd seen on people at the end of conversations they didn't expect to matter. "It was good to meet you, Landon," she said. "You too." He shifted Mia on his hip. "Hope your week gets less complicated." "Hope you're—" She stopped. Looked at Mia, then at him. "Hope she feels better fast." "She will. She's tough without meaning to be." Victoria smiled. Not a small, polite smile. A real one, slow and wide, that she didn't seem to have ready prepared. It changed her face entirely. He pushed out the door into the cool, wet air. Behind him he heard her push out a second later, going the other direction. He got Mia into the truck and buckled and closed the door gently, and stood for a second in the rain that had thinned to a mist. He didn't know why he felt the specific lack of her already. He drove home through streets that were clean and dark and rain-washed, Mia asleep in the back, his hands steady on the wheel and the engine grinding near the axle, and the pharmacy bag on the passenger seat, and $9.40 to last until Friday. He drove home thinking about the way she'd said that counts for more than knowing what you're doing, and the particular quality of her voice when she said it, like someone speaking a truth they'd learned by not having it. He drove home thinking he'd probably never see her again. He was wrong. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, Landon was at his kitchen table with Mia's custody paperwork spread out in front of him when his phone rang. It was his attorney, Dan Kowalski, who had the delivery style of someone who'd learned to front-load bad news to save time. "Landon," Dan said, "we've got a problem." "I know about the emails," Landon said. "It's not just emails anymore. Greystone's people filed a motion yesterday. They're formally challenging your custody arrangement. They've submitted documentation alleging that your living situation is inadequate and your financial instability poses a risk to Mia's well-being. A pause. They've submitted evidence, Landon. Photos, financial records, some kind of incident report from a neighbor about domestic noise. Landon sat very still. The noise complaint is from February, he said. That was the night the upstairs neighbor's pipe burst and flooded my ceiling. There was nothing domestic about it. I know that and you know that, Dan said. But it's in the filing. Landon stared at the kitchen table. Mia was in her room. He could hear her talking to her stuffed animals. A running narration she maintained like a radio station, the sound of her managing a world she understood. What does this mean for the hearing? He asked. It means we have less time than we thought, Dan said. And we need to figure out where these documents came from, because some of these financial records aren't things that should be easily accessible. Landon picked up the pen on the table and set it back down. The table had a ring stain from a coffee cup. He'd been meaning to sand and refinish it for a year. Small things you meant to get to. Okay, he said. Landon. I said okay, Dan. He kept his voice very level. Tell me what you need from me. He sat at that table for a long time after he hung up. He sat there listening to Mia talk to her animals, narrating a world where everything went the way she decided. He didn't know that 37 floors above the city, in a glass office he'd never set foot in, a woman named Victoria Sterling was staring at a set of documents that were about to tear her world open at the seams, and that his name was in those documents. He didn't know yet, but that was coming. The Monday after the storm, Victoria Sterling walked into the 42nd floor of Sterling Group's headquarters on North Michigan Avenue, and knew before she'd cleared the elevator that something was wrong. It wasn't anything specific. It was the way Elena at the front desk looked up and then quickly looked back down. It was the way two people in the open workspace stopped their conversation a half-second too long before resuming it. Small things. Victoria had spent 10 years learning to read rooms the way other people read weather. Not by waiting for the storm, but by feeling the pressure drop. She set her bag down at her desk, pulled up her email, and started reading. By 8:15 she'd found it. A piece in the Chicago Financial Press. Not a major outlet, but a trade publication that the right people read, with the headline, Sterling Group CEO Under Fire as Board Questions, Q3 Strategy Decisions. The article quoted two anonymous senior sources within the company who described Victoria's recent pivot away from a major residential acquisition as impulsive and potentially damaging to investor confidence. There was a photograph of her from the Meridian Gala 2 weeks ago, taken from an angle that made her look like she was turning away from something. She read it twice. Then she closed the tab and sat for a moment looking at her hands on the keyboard. The acquisition they were referring to was the Lakeview residential portfolio, a set of aging apartment complexes on the northwest side that Greystone Development had brought to Sterling's board as a partnership opportunity in August. Victoria had reviewed the numbers herself. The buildings were undervalued, yes. The acquisition price was reasonable. But there were irregularities in the tenant displacement projections that she'd flagged immediately. The model assumed a 60% vacancy rate within 18 months through natural attrition, which was not what natural attrition looked like in those neighborhoods. It was what aggressive lease non-renewal and code enforcement pressure looked like. She'd killed the deal in September. Two board members, Richard Harlan and Dennis Falk, had argued against her decision for 3 hours in a closed session. They'd lost, but they hadn't been gracious about it. The article was their response. She was still sitting with that realization when her assistant Marcus knocked once and came in. Marcus was 26, efficient to a fault, and had the specific skill of telling her things she didn't want to hear with exactly enough neutrality that she couldn't reasonably shoot the messenger. Harlan's called an emergency board meeting, he said. Thursday. He's framed it as a strategic review. Framed it as, she repeated. His words were an opportunity to align on vision going forward. I'm just giving you the translation. Victoria looked at the window. 42 floors up, the city was flat and gray and enormous. Who else is on his side? Falk, definitely. Possibly Renata Solis, though she hasn't committed. Marcus paused. He also had a 40-minute call with Gerald Webb on Friday afternoon. I only know that because Gerald's assistant mentioned it to ours by accident. Gerald Webb, who ran Greystone Development, who had brought them the Lakeview deal she'd killed. Of course he did, Victoria said. She pulled up the board charter and started reading. The thing about Victoria Sterling was that she had not inherited her position. Her father, Charles Sterling, had built the company from a mid-sized real estate investment firm into something significantly larger over 30 years. And when he'd handed her the CEO role 4 years ago, half the board had expected her to be a figurehead, someone to sit in the chair while the real decisions happened in the corridors around her. She had spent 4 years demonstrating, with patience and precision, that this was not how it was going to go. She had grown the portfolio by 22%. She had navigated 2 market contractions without a single major asset write-down. She had made decisions that looked wrong for 6 months and right for 3 years. But she'd made enemies doing it. That was the part that didn't get written about. She spent the morning preparing for Thursday. She went through every strategic decision she'd made in Q3, built the rationale documentation, pulled the independent market analyses that supported her calls. It was methodical work, the kind she was good at, and for most of the morning she was able to stay inside it and not feel what was underneath it, which was the simple, tired fact of being the person in the room that other people were always looking for a way around. Around noon, she took a break and stood at the window with a coffee she'd forgotten to drink while it was hot. She thought, for no reason she could easily explain, about Landon Hayes in the laundromat, saying, "I like building things that stand up." She found the Greystone files by accident. It was Wednesday evening. She was in her office late, working through the board presentation, and she'd asked Marcus to pull every document related to the Lakeview acquisition so she could build a clean timeline. He'd left a stack of folders on her desk before heading out, and she'd been going through them for an hour when she found a memo that shouldn't have been in the stack. It was an internal Greystone document, not something that Sterling Group should have had, which meant someone had passed it from Greystone to a Sterling board member who had then somehow let it end up in the acquisition file. Whether that was careless or calculated, she couldn't tell yet, but the document itself was the thing that made her stop. It was a tenant impact summary for the Lakeview properties, the kind of document that development companies prepared to assess how many people would need to be displaced for a project to be viable. Standard practice in real estate. The problem was this particular document wasn't assessing it as a future risk. It was describing an ongoing process. Residents at 2 of the Lakeview buildings were already experiencing what the memo called transition facilitation, a phrase that, read against the actual descriptions in the document, meant lease termination pressure, selective maintenance failures, and at least one instance of a code violation being reported to city authorities by someone other than a tenant. Victoria read that page 3 times. Transition facilitation. She sat back in her chair and looked at the office ceiling. Somewhere in those buildings, in the apartments that she'd made the call not to acquire, there were actual people dealing with the fallout of decisions made in rooms like this one. She kept reading. An hour later, she found a list of case numbers. Greystone had apparently encountered some legal resistance from tenants and had been running a parallel track, using a third-party property management company to file noise complaints, code violations, and in several cases, allegations about tenant behavior, to build records that could support eviction proceedings or custody challenges in cases where... She stopped. She went back and read that sentence again. Custody challenges. The memo referenced 3 specific cases where residents with minor children had been specifically targeted for expanded documentation because families were harder to pressure through lease mechanisms alone, but were more vulnerable through family court processes. The logic was explicit and completely cold. It was cheaper to build a file than to litigate. A family under enough legal pressure would move. A parent afraid of losing custody of their children would move. Victoria set the document down on her desk very carefully. She thought about Landon's face in the laundromat, the 3 emails from an attorney that he'd looked at and closed without opening, the exhaustion in him that was something other than physical. She'd noticed it at the time and filed it away because it wasn't hers to ask about. She picked up the document again and looked for any names. There were case numbers, not names. Privacy compliance, probably, or just habit. But there were addresses. She wrote 3 of them down on a notepad, then stopped and looked at what she was doing. She was writing down addresses from a document she'd found accidentally in a file that shouldn't contain it, with the half-formed idea of, what, exactly? Checking something? Against what? She didn't have Landon's last name. She didn't have his address. She had a man she'd met once in a laundromat who'd bought medicine for his sick daughter in a rainstorm and told her about a building on North Clark that was still standing. She folded the notepad page and put it in her jacket pocket. She photographed every page of the Greystone memo and sent it to her personal encrypted drive. Then she picked up her phone and called her attorney. Thursday's board meeting ran 3.5 hours. Harlan had prepared well. He came in with slide presentations and market comparables and a very polished argument about consistent strategic vision, which was the kind of language that sounded neutral and meant something pointed. He had Falk flanking him, and a consultant Victoria didn't recognize in the corner taking notes, which she logged and didn't comment on yet. She let him finish. She always let them finish. Then she presented her own case. She was calm and detailed, and she'd done the documentation right, which meant there was nothing in her Q3 record that didn't have a defensible rationale attached to it. The Lakeview decision she presented last, with the independent market analysis, the risk assessments, and the regulatory exposure projections she'd commissioned in September. She did not mention the Greystone memo. Not yet. Harlan pushed back twice. She answered directly and didn't elaborate beyond what was necessary. Falk tried a flank argument about investor confidence, and she walked him through the actual investor communication record, which showed no significant concern from major shareholders. Renata Solis, who had been watching all of this carefully from the far end of the table, asked 2 clarifying questions about the risk modeling and seemed satisfied with the answers. At the end of the 3.5 hours, the board voted not to call a formal review of her performance. 5-2, Harlan and Falk dissenting. Victoria accepted the vote without expression, thanked the board members for their time, and walked back to her office. She sat at her desk for 10 minutes doing nothing. Then she let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding since Monday. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "You okay?" "I need the corporate registry filings for Greystone Development going back 5 years," she said. "And I need to know every entity that shares board members with Greystone. Parent companies, subsidiaries, affiliated LLCs, everything." He blinked. I know how long it takes. Start tonight." He started to leave, then turned back. "Are you actually okay?" Victoria looked at him. "No," she said, "but I'm working on it. Go." The Greystone thread took 4 days to follow, and it went in directions she hadn't expected. By Sunday evening, with Marcus working alongside her and an outside forensic accounting firm she'd retained on a confidentiality basis, the picture that emerged was detailed enough that she sat back from her desk and just looked at it for a while. Greystone Development was a subsidiary, not well publicized, not obviously connected in the public-facing materials, but the ownership chain was there if you knew how to read corporate registry filings, which Victoria did. Greystone was controlled through 2 layers of LLC structure by a holding company called Meridian Realty Partners. Meridian Realty Partners had 3 principal investors. One of them was an entity called Harlan Capital Management, as in Richard Harlan, her board member. She'd suspected it when she started looking. Finding it confirmed still felt like a door opening onto something cold. Harlan had brought her the Lakeview deal through Greystone. She'd killed it. Greystone was now running a campaign against residents in those buildings, using methods she'd just read about in a memo that ended up in her files. And Harlan was simultaneously trying to undermine her board position. The only question was how long this had been going on. Marcus pulled a chair up and dropped a printout on the desk. Meridian's acquired 14 residential properties in Chicago in the last 3 years. I cross-referenced the acquisition timelines with tenant displacement data from city housing records. He paused. In 11 of the 14 properties, average occupancy dropped by more than 50% within 18 months of acquisition. In 6 of those cases, there are active housing court records from tenants. Victoria looked at the list of addresses. She looked at the 3 addresses she'd written on the notepad page still folded in her jacket, hanging on the back of her office door. She got up, got the jacket, unfolded the page. 2 of the 3 addresses were on Marcus's list. "Cross-reference these," she said, handing him the page. "I want names associated with the active court records on these 2 properties." He looked at her. "Where'd these come from?" "The Greystone memo that ended up in the acquisition file. Don't ask me why it was there yet. I don't have that answer." She sat back down. "Just run it." He came back 20 minutes later with a printout and set it on her desk without saying anything, which was already a signal. She read the names. There were 8 active cases associated with those 2 properties. Noise complaints, code violation filings, 1 case involving a formal allegation of property damage by a tenant. 7 of the 8 had addresses that matched current residents. The 8th had a different notation. It wasn't a housing case. It was a family court motion filed by a third-party petitioner under a case number associated with a custody challenge. The name attached to the case was Landon Hayes. Victoria sat very still. The address on the filing was 6 blocks from Clark Street, Wash. She knew that because she'd looked up the laundromat's address 2 days after their meeting, which she'd told herself was nothing, just something she did. A person could look up an address without it meaning anything specific. She sat still for a long time. Then she pulled up everything she could find. Landon Hayes, age 32. Construction tradesman with a current contract through Apex Building Group on a Wicker Park commercial renovation. Clean record. No prior family court history. His daughter Mia Hayes, age 8, currently in his sole legal custody following the death of her mother. She found the obituary, Elena Hayes, 29, 3 years ago, cardiac event, with no prior challenge to that custody arrangement. The custody motion had been filed 11 days ago by a legal entity Victoria had to run twice through the corporate search to untangle. It originated from a law firm that had been retained by a property management company that was a subsidiary of a company that Marcus had already identified as a Meridian affiliate. They had targeted him specifically. For what? To pressure him to vacate an apartment in a building they were trying to clear? Or because he'd been resistant to something, asked questions, filed a complaint that created documentation they didn't want? She didn't have that granularity yet. She had enough. She stood up, walked to the window. 42 floors. The city was dark and lit and enormous and completely indifferent, the way cities are, the way they just go on being cities, no matter what is happening in the individual units of life stacked inside them. She thought about him sitting in that plastic chair at 1 in the morning with his hands on his knees, looking at emails he was too tired to open. She thought about him moving Mia to the truck with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it alone long enough that it didn't look hard from the outside, even when it was very hard from the inside. She thought about the way he'd said, "She's the funniest person I've ever met," and how his voice went different when he talked about his daughter, how all the tired flatness fell out of it. She turned back to her desk. "Marcus," she said, "I need everything you have on the Hayes custody filing. Who filed it, who signed off, what documentation they submitted, and which law firm is representing Greystone's property management arm in Chicago Family Court." Marcus looked up. "This is personal." "Yes. This isn't a company matter. Richard Harlan has a financial stake in the organization that's targeting this man's custody rights," she said, "and Harlan is on my board, so it is absolutely a company matter." She held his gaze. "But also, yes, it's personal." He didn't ask her to explain. He just nodded and went back to the desk. She pulled her phone out and stared at it for a moment. She didn't have Landon's number. She'd never asked for it. She hadn't thought there'd be a reason to. She put the phone face down on the desk. There was a version of this where she handed everything to her attorney, let the legal process work, and kept her distance from a situation that had nothing directly to do with her. It was the clean version, the defensible version. She knew she wasn't going to take it. What she didn't know yet was that Landon had already found something out about her. Not everything, not the Greystone connection, not any of the things she'd spent the last 4 days uncovering, just the simple surface thing, the thing anyone could find with a 20-second internet search. She'd slipped up in the laundromat. "My security team hates it." And if you put that together with a woman who showed up alone to a North Side laundromat after midnight following what she'd described as a very public, very visible week, and you searched Victoria Sterling Chicago. She didn't know he'd done that search. She didn't know he'd been sitting with what he found for 3 days, and that it had shifted something in him, a careful, quiet closing off. The particular way a person pulls back when they feel like they've been naive about something. She didn't know any of that yet. She only found out 2 days later when she tracked down his work site on Wicker Park and walked across a construction lot in shoes entirely wrong for the terrain and found him 40 feet away, staring at her with an expression that was not what she'd been hoping for. "You're Victoria Sterling," he said. The way he said it told her everything about the 3 days he'd spent sitting with what he'd found. "Yes," she said. "You have a net worth of $3 billion. Approximately." He looked at her for a long moment. Around them the site went on. Men moving, machines running, the ordinary noise of building things. He stood very still inside all of it. "And you didn't say anything," he said, "that whole night." "Neither did you," she said. "About the attorneys, about the custody filing." His jaw tightened. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She held his gaze. "But I'm here now and I need you to listen to me because I found something, and it involves you directly. And whatever you think about who I am or what I should have said in a laundromat, this part matters." He didn't move. "Please," she said. The word cost her something. He could see it did. That was the thing about Victoria Sterling that the business press didn't write about. She wasn't cold, she was careful, and those two things looked identical from the outside until they didn't. Landon looked away, across the site. He looked at the frame of the building going up. Steel and concrete and work, and the ordinary fact of things being made. He looked back at her. "You've got 10 minutes, he said. "Talk." He gave her 10 minutes standing on a construction site, and she talked for 8 of them without stopping. She laid it out the way she'd learned to present in boardrooms. Clean, sequential, no editorializing, just the facts in the order they connected. Greystone Development. The Lakeview acquisition she'd killed in September. The memo she'd found in the file that shouldn't have contained it. The corporate ownership chain that led from Greystone up through Meridian Realty Partners to Harlan Capital Management, which was Richard Harlan, who sat on her board. The tenant displacement pattern across 14 properties. The specific documentation strategy targeting families with children. The custody filing attached to his name and address. Landon didn't say anything while she talked. He stood with his arms crossed and his weight back slightly, the posture of someone who has learned that staying physically still is a way of keeping everything else still, too. Behind him, a nail gun fired in short bursts. Somewhere above them, a man shouted something about load tolerances. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Say the last part again," he said. "The custody filing was initiated by a legal entity connected to a Meridian affiliate. They are using family court as a displacement mechanism. It's cheaper than prolonged lease litigation, and families with children are, their word, more vulnerable through that channel." She watched him process it. She could see it moving through him. Not the confusion of someone hearing something unbelievable, but the recognition of someone hearing the explanation for something they'd already been living. The pieces settling into the shape they'd always had. "The noise complaint," he said, "from February. It's in the documentation they submitted. The pipe burst. The ceiling came down at 2 in the morning. I was on the phone with the building manager for an hour." His jaw was tight. "There was nothing domestic about it." "I know." "You know because you read a file." "Yes." He turned away from her and looked at the building frame. Steel columns and raw concrete floors, open to the sky on the upper levels. The skeleton of something that would eventually be enclosed and finished and stood in by people who'd never think about what it looked like at this stage. He stood there for a moment and she let him. "How did they get my financial records?" he said. "I don't have that answer yet. My attorney is working on the document sourcing. The records they submitted to family court aren't the kind of thing that comes from public sources. Someone pulled them deliberately. Someone with resources." "Yes." He turned back. His eyes were dark and direct, and she could see the anger in him, but it was the controlled kind, the kind that had been compressed by being useful for too long. "And Harlan, he knows you found this?" "No, not yet." "What does not yet mean?" "It means I haven't decided how to move," she said, "and I needed you to know what was happening before I did." He looked at her for a long time. The site noise continued around them, indifferent. Someone called his name from the other side of the lot, and he raised a hand without turning to acknowledge it, the signal for, "Give me a minute." "Why?" he said. "Because it's your life they're taking apart." She held his gaze. "Because you should know. Because—" She stopped and started differently. "Because I sat across from you in a laundromat, and you were honest with me, and I wasn't completely honest with you, and this is me trying to correct that. By showing up at my job site. I didn't have your number. You could have left a note at the laundromat. Would you have called a number on a note left at a laundromat?" He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. "I have a meeting with my attorney this afternoon," she said. "I'm also going to start the process of bringing what I have to the board, formally. Harlan's conflict of interest in the Lakeview decision is a fiduciary violation. The tenant displacement operation, if it's been running as long as I think it has, is beyond a civil matter. She paused. I'm going to need your attorney's information. Dan Kowalski, I'm guessing, based on the filing response. He stared at her. How do you know Dan Kowalski's name? It was on the response filing, public record. She met his look steadily. I read everything, Landon. That's what I do. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked down at the ground, packed dirt and gravel and the marks of heavy equipment, and then back up at her. You understand I'm not going to let you just handle this, he said. I'm not trying to handle it. I'm trying to... You come in here with a folder of documents and a plan and a timeline, and that's exactly what handling it looks like from where I'm standing. His voice wasn't loud, but there was something hard in it. This is my daughter, my custody. You don't get to make decisions about this and tell me after. I'm telling you before. You're telling me the plan is already in motion. She paused. Because he wasn't wrong, not entirely. She had called her attorney the night before. She had started the documentation. She had made some moves that were already in motion before she'd found him this morning. Yes, she said. Some of it is. He looked away. When he looked back, his expression had shifted slightly, less anger and more something else that was harder to read. What do you need from me? The question surprised her. She'd expected more resistance, more time. The fact that he'd moved past it that fast told her something about how he'd gotten through the last 3 years. He didn't have the luxury of staying in the feeling. He had to know what came next. A meeting with you and Kowalski, she said, and whatever documentation you have on the original noise complaint and the pipe burst. Physical evidence, photos if you took them, the building manager's contact information. I have photos. He pulled out his phone, scrolled, turned it toward her. Water damage on the ceiling, serious and visible. The timestamp 2:17 a.m. on a February date that matched exactly. 12 of them. Send those to me. She gave him her direct email address. He looked at it, typed it in, and sent the photos without comment. What about Harlan? He said. That's mine to deal with. And when it gets messy, because it's going to get messy. I know. You're going to take a hit for this. Publicly. Probably. He studied her. Why is that worth it to you? She didn't answer immediately. She could have given him the answer she gave in boardrooms. Ethical obligation, legal exposure, fiduciary responsibility. All of those things were true. None of them were the full answer. I killed the Lakeview deal because the numbers told me people would get hurt, she said, and they got hurt anyway because I didn't follow the thread far enough. I stopped at no. She paused. I should have asked why they wanted yes so badly. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Something in his expression settled. I'll call Kowalski today, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me. You're helping yourself as much as you're helping me. That's true, she said. It's still worth thanking. She turned to go. She'd gotten 4 steps across the gravel when he spoke again. Victoria. She turned. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked like a man who had just decided to say something he'd been holding for 3 days. I looked you up, he said, after the laundromat, when you mentioned the security team. I figured. I wasn't angry that you didn't tell me who you were. He stopped, working out how to say it accurately. I was angry because I didn't feel like an idiot the whole time we were talking, and then I found out maybe I should have. Victoria was still. You didn't make me feel like an idiot, he said. That's not something you can fake for 2 hours in a laundromat, but it messed with my head knowing. So, he shifted his weight. That's what it was. She looked at him. For what it's worth, she said, you were the most straightforward person I'd talked to in months. That also isn't something you can fake. He nodded once. She turned and walked back across the lot, stepping carefully around the uneven ground. And she didn't look back, because she had learned a long time ago that looking back on a construction site was how you turned your ankle. The meeting with Kowalski happened 2 days later in his office on West Madison, a third-floor walk-up that smelled like old coffee and paper files, which Victoria found unexpectedly reassuring. Lawyers with offices that looked like movie sets made her nervous. Lawyers with offices that looked like they'd been working in them for 20 years made her think actual work might get done. Dan Kowalski was 54, stocky, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and the kind of practiced stillness that good litigators develop after years of hearing things that would make other people react. He read through the documents Victoria had brought, printed, organized, tabbed, without saying anything for 11 minutes. Landon sat beside her and also didn't say anything, which she appreciated. She'd half expected him to fill the silence. When Kowalski finally set the papers down, he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at both of them. "This is either very good or very complicated," he said. "Both," Victoria said. "The custody motion was the mechanism, not the goal," he said. "They don't actually want custody of your daughter. They want you out of the apartment." "I know," Landon said. "Which means if we can demonstrate to the court that the filing was made in bad faith and the documentation was manufactured or obtained improperly, the motion collapses." He tapped the papers. "The financial records they submitted. Do you know where those came from?" "My working theory is that someone inside the building management company had access to tenant financial information from lease applications," Victoria said. "Standard practice is to run credit and income checks. That data shouldn't be retained in a form that could be passed to outside legal counsel, but if you have someone inside who's motivated, and the motivation is Meridian telling their property management arm to make the case," Kowalski said. "Yes." He put his glasses back on and made a note. "The chain of custody on these documents is going to matter. If I can show the court that the financial records were obtained through improper retention of lease application data, I can get them excluded. Without the financial records, their argument about instability is largely subjective." "The noise complaint," Landon said. "February." "I've got photos with timestamps," Victoria said. She pulled up her phone and showed him. 12 images of water damage from a pipe burst, taken at 2 in the morning on a date that predates the complaint by 6 hours. The complaint was filed the next day by an anonymous source, which I'd argue is your building management company. Kowalski looked at the photos. "These are good." He looked at Landon. "Your building manager. Is he cooperative?" "He's been trying to get the washing machine fixed for 6 weeks," Landon said. "He's not the problem. He's just overwhelmed. I need a written statement from him about the pipe incident." He made another note. "I need it this week." "I'll get it." Kowalski set his pen down and looked at both of them over his glasses. "The larger case, the Harlan connection, the Meridian operation, the systematic displacement, that's not family court territory. That's going to be regulatory, possibly criminal, depending on how the documentation of the displacement strategy reads legally. If what you have here is accurate," he tapped the corporate ownership analysis, "and it looks accurate, you're looking at potential fraud in the family court filings and fair housing violations at minimum." "I know," Victoria said. "I have outside counsel on the corporate governance side. I want the family court matter handled separately and faster. The hearing date, 4 weeks, Kowalski said, looking at Landon. 4 weeks, Landon confirmed. He said it the way people say things they've been counting. "We can work with 4 weeks, Kowalski said. "It's going to be tight, but the evidence here is strong if we can get the documentation chain established." He paused. "Ms. Sterling, I have to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Your involvement in this creates potential complications. You're connected to the opposing party through corporate structure. You're CEO of a company whose board member has a financial interest in Greystone, and you now have a personal connection to my client." He said it evenly, without judgment. "Any of that can be used to undermine the credibility of what you've brought if opposing counsel gets creative." "I know." "How personal is personal?" There was a brief silence. Landon was looking at the wall. Victoria looked at Kowalski. "We met once before I found any of this," she said, "in a laundromat. We talked for a couple of hours. I didn't know who he was in any relevant sense, and he didn't know who I was. And now? And now I know what's being done to him, and I'm not going to do nothing about it." Kowalski held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. "Okay," he said simply, and went back to his notes. They walked out of Kowalski's building onto West Madison, and the day was cold and clean, the sky bright in that specific Chicago October way that felt like the city trying to apologize for the coming winter. Landon stood on the sidewalk and turned his collar up against the wind. "He's good," Victoria said. "He's the only attorney I could afford who wasn't going to take a percentage of something I don't have." "He's still good." "Yeah." He looked down the street. "Thank you. For the documents." "I'm still cleaning up my own mess," she said. "You keep saying that." Because it keeps being true. He looked at her. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she pushed it back impatiently, the same gesture she'd made in the laundromat when the ponytail came loose. She had a talent for looking completely composed and slightly undone at the same time, and he'd noticed that in the laundromat too without filing it as anything notable, and now he was noticing it again. "Mia's been asking about the lady from the laundromat," he said. Victoria blinked. "What?" "She remembers you," she said, and I'm quoting directly, "the lady with the broken hair was nice." He paused. "She's been asking if we'll see you again." "What did you tell her?" "I didn't know what to tell her." They stood on the sidewalk in the wind, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'd like to see her again," Victoria said. She said it straightforwardly, without decoration, which was the only way she knew how to say things she actually meant. "If that's something you'd be okay with." "I'll think about it." He said it without dismissiveness, which meant he actually would. "I need to get back to the site. I lost 2 hours this morning." "I know. Go." She started to turn. "Victoria." He said her name the way people say names when they're still getting used to the fact that the person they're saying it to is real and specific and standing in front of them. "What you're doing with the board, with Harlan, that's going to cost you something." "Maybe." "Not maybe. People like Harlan don't go quietly. He's got money, and he's got motive, and he's going to come back at you hard." "I know." "And you're doing it anyway." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not softening exactly, more like the opposite of the closing off she'd seen at the construction site 2 days ago. A small, careful opening. "Okay," he said. That was all. He walked up the street. She watched him go for a second, then turned the other way and pulled out her phone and called her attorney before she'd reached the corner. She confronted Harlan on a Monday. She'd wanted to do it in the full board session, on the record, with documentation in front of everyone. Her attorney advised against it, cleaner to give him the chance to respond privately first, both legally and strategically. She did it his way, which she didn't like, but she understood the reasoning. She called Harlan into her office at 9 in the morning and closed the door and put the corporate registry documents on the desk in front of him without preamble. "Meridian Realty Partners," she said. "Harlan Capital Management. Your interest in Greystone Development. The Lakeview acquisition you brought to this board." Harlan was 61, silver-haired, with the groomed confidence of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where he held more leverage than the other people. He looked at the documents on her desk without touching them. I was quiet for a moment, which was not a guilty silence. It was the silence of someone recalibrating, reading the situation, deciding which version of this to play. "There's no legal prohibition on a board member having indirect interests in companies that bring acquisition opportunities to the board," he said. "Disclosed conflict. You didn't disclose it. The connection is indirect, through 2 LLCs, which is 2 more layers than should be necessary if there's nothing to disclose." She kept her voice level. She'd practiced this part. "I'm not interested in the acquisition discussion right now. I'm interested in this." She put the Greystone tenant impact memo on the desk. He looked at it. Something moved in his face. Not guilt, not exactly, but the recognition that a document he'd known about was now in a room he hadn't wanted it in. "That's a Greystone operational document," he said. "It ended up in Sterling's acquisition file. I don't know if that was an accident or if someone put it there expecting it not to be noticed. Either way, I read it." She paused. "They're using family court filings as a displacement mechanism. They're targeting families with children. They've manufactured documentation to support custody challenges against tenants they want out." She held his gaze. "That's in your investment's operational playbook. I don't control Greystone's operational decisions. You have a financial interest in their outcomes. Having an interest in a company doesn't make me responsible for Richard." She said his name once, flat. He stopped. "I have a forensic accounting firm outside counsel, and a family court attorney who together have documented the chain of ownership, the tenant displacement pattern across 14 properties, and the specific case of a man named Landon Hayes, whose custody filing was initiated through an entity 3 layers below your investment vehicle." She let that sit for a second. "I'm giving you this conversation before I take it to the full board and to regulatory counsel because that's the process. Not because I'm uncertain about what I'm going to do." The room was quiet. Harlan looked at the documents on her desk. He looked at her. She could see him running calculations. Legal exposure, reputational risk, board dynamics, what he had left to leverage, and whether any of it was worth using. You're going to blow up your own board over this, he said. Over documented fraud and illegal displacement practices? Yes. You'll lose allies, Falk, possibly Solis. Solis asked me 2 clarifying questions in that board meeting last week that told me she already has doubts about you, but that's not the point. She leaned forward slightly. The point is that real people are losing their homes and their families because of a financial structure you're part of. And it has been going on, at my company's Connected Investments, while I sat at the head of this table. That is not something I'm going to leave alone. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set, and his eyes were cold, and he looked like a man who'd lost a negotiation and was already thinking about the next move. You'll regret this, he said. Maybe, she said, but not for the reasons you're thinking. He stood, picked up his jacket from the chair, and left without taking the documents, which meant he'd already seen them before, which meant he'd known they existed. She'd suspected that. Having it confirmed felt like something clicking into place. Not satisfying, just true. She sat alone in her office for a while after he left. The city was gray outside the window. She thought about Landon in the laundromat with $9.40 and a prescription bag, and a sick daughter asleep across plastic chairs, and the emails from Marcus Webb's attorney that he'd looked at and closed without opening because he was too tired to face them that night and too stubborn to fall apart about them. She thought about the way he'd said, "I like building things that stand up," as if that were a simple thing instead of the whole point. She picked up her phone. She had 17 unread messages, 2 missed calls from board members who'd already heard something was happening, and 1 text from a number she'd saved under a first name only. The text from Landon said, "Mia wants to know if the lady with the broken hair likes dinosaurs." Apparently this is relevant information. Victoria looked at it for a moment. Then she typed back, "Tell her I'm open to being educated on the subject." She set the phone down and picked up her board presentation and went back to work. Outside, the city continued being a city, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere 6 blocks from a laundromat on Milwaukee Avenue, an 8-year-old girl was preparing, without knowing it, to become the most effective argument for why any of this was worth fighting for. The dinosaur conversation happened on a Saturday. Landon had picked up a half-day shift that morning and was back by noon, which meant Mia had spent the morning with Mrs. Okafor next door, which meant Mia had spent the morning eating plantains and watching nature documentaries, which meant by the time Victoria arrived at 2 in the afternoon, Mia had very specific opinions about the therapsid lineage that she was prepared to share immediately. Victoria had shown up with coffee for Landon and a small illustrated dinosaur encyclopedia that she'd bought because she'd looked up which dinosaur books are actually good the night before, and spent 40 minutes reading reviews, which was something she'd done without deciding to do it, and only noticed afterward. Mia had taken one look at the book, flipped to the Stegosaurus section, and announced that stegosaurs had brains the size of walnuts and yet managed to survive for longer than most animals alive today, which she felt was an important lesson about not needing to be smart to be successful. "Where did she get that?" Victoria said quietly to Landon while Mia was cross-referencing something in the index. "Mrs. Okafor's documentaries," he said. "I don't ask too many questions about the philosophical framework." "It's not wrong, though." "No," he agreed. "It's really not." The afternoon had moved in the unplanned way that good afternoons sometimes do. Mia showing Victoria her drawing collection, which was spread across a folder that had been through some things structurally. Victoria sitting on the couch and looking at each drawing with the genuine attention of someone who wasn't performing interest. Landon had watched from the kitchen doorway for a while, holding his coffee, and noticed the way Victoria didn't talk down to Mia and didn't try too hard either. She just talked to her, like a person. That was harder than it looked. He knew because he'd watched adults get it wrong with Mia his whole life. "You draw all of these yourself?" Victoria asked, holding up a picture that appeared to be a dinosaur in what might have been a business suit. "That's a stegosaurus going to a job interview," Mia said. "He didn't get the job." "What job was it?" Mia thought about this carefully. "Accountant." Victoria kept her face completely neutral. "Understandable. The plates probably don't fit the dress code." Mia stared at her for a second and then laughed, sudden and delighted, the kind of laugh that 8-year-olds produce when something is funnier than they expected. She took the drawing back and added something to it with a marker. She held it up. She'd drawn a tiny briefcase. "Now he's going to a different interview," Mia said. "Better prospects," Victoria agreed. Landon went back to the kitchen. He stood at the counter and drank his coffee and listened to his daughter talk to a woman he'd met in a laundromat 3 weeks ago. And he felt something he didn't have a clean name for. Not happiness, exactly. More like the particular relief of something being okay that you'd been afraid wasn't going to be okay, mixed with the particular fear of wanting something to keep being okay once you'd allowed yourself to notice it was. He was not good at wanting things to stay. He'd learned to be careful about that. The board meeting happened the following Thursday. Victoria had spent the week preparing the way she prepared for things that mattered, thoroughly, without sleeping enough, running the document package through outside counsel twice before she was satisfied. She had the corporate registry chain, the forensic accounting analysis of Meridian's acquisition pattern, the Greystone tenant impact memo, and a supplementary brief from her attorney that laid out the specific fiduciary violations in Harlan's undisclosed conflict of interest during the Lakeview vote. She presented it to the full board in a 2-hour session that she'd scheduled under the agenda item Material Governance Disclosure, which was vague enough that Harlan didn't know the specific scope until she started talking. He knew within 3 minutes. She could see it in the way he stopped taking notes. She walked through the ownership chain first. Clean, documented, no editorializing, just the corporate structure and the legal obligations it triggered. 3 board members were reading the documents as she went. Solis had her reading glasses on. The consultant from Harlan's earlier meeting was notably absent from this one. When she got to the tenant displacement operation, she slowed down and was more specific. She put the Greystone memo on the table. She put the 14 property displacement data on the table. She described the family court mechanism in plain language and watched the room react to it, which it did. Not dramatically, but in the small ways that rooms react to things that are genuinely bad. A shift in posture. Someone setting a pen down. Harlan spoke twice during the presentation. The first time he raised a procedural objection about the sourcing of the Greystone memo, which her attorney had already briefed her to answer, and she answered it directly. The second time he said the tenant data was being mischaracterized, and that residential transitions were a normal part of portfolio management. The room was quiet after that one. Solis said, without looking up from the memo, "This document uses the phrase custody vulnerability as leverage. In what reading of normal portfolio management does that appear?" Harlan didn't answer. The vote to initiate a formal governance investigation into Harlan's undisclosed conflicts was 6-1. Harlan voting against his own investigation, which was its own kind of statement. He resigned from the board the next morning before the investigation formally opened. His attorney sent a letter that used the phrase mutual decision to part ways twice in 2 paragraphs, which Victoria's attorney described as the most transparent piece of legal fiction he'd read that year. Falk followed him out 4 days later, citing personal reasons, which everyone understood, and nobody said. The press got it by the end of the week. It started with the Financial Trade publication, the same one that had run the piece questioning Victoria's Q3 strategy, publishing a short item about the board shakeup and Harlan's departure. That piece was neutral and factual, and would have stayed contained, but someone inside Greystone's property management arm had apparently decided that being ahead of the story was better than being behind it, and they'd talked to a reporter at a larger outlet. By Friday morning, the story was bigger than a governance item. It had the elements that made things spread: a billionaire CEO, a systematic operation targeting vulnerable families, family court filings used as eviction tools. The headline that ran in the Metro section of the Tribune was blunt in the way Metro reporters are when they're mad about something. Victoria's phone did not stop. She handled the first wave of media through her communications director, which was the right call. Measured statements, factual, no performative outrage. She was not going to stand at a microphone and make herself the hero of this story, because the story wasn't about her. She'd said that to her communications director twice, and the second time she'd said it more clearly. The story is about the people in those buildings, not about me. Her communications director had given her a look that said, "I understand, but the press will make it about you anyway," and she'd said, "I know, do the best you can." What she didn't fully anticipate was the way it would move among the residents of the affected buildings. She found out about that through a different channel, not media, not legal, but through a phone call she got on Saturday morning from a woman named Patricia Osei, who identified herself as a tenant organizer at one of the Meridian properties on the northwest side. Patricia Osei was 53, spoke with the particular clarity of someone who had been explaining injustice to people for decades, and had long since run out of patience for soft language. And she had two things she wanted to say. The first was that she and the other tenant advocates had documentation going back further than what Victoria's team had found. Complaints, records, photographs of selective maintenance failures, a detailed timeline of lease non-renewals that would be available to Victoria's attorneys. The second thing was more direct. I want to know if this is real or if you're managing a narrative, Patricia said. Victoria was standing in her kitchen in the first quiet moment she'd had since Thursday. It's real, she said, because corporations do this. They perform accountability when the story gets out, and then they negotiate settlements and the story goes away and the people in the buildings are still in the buildings. I know they do, so I'm asking directly. The governance investigation is formally opened. Harlan's out, the family court case connected to this. We have a hearing date and the documentation to challenge the filing. I have outside counsel working on regulatory referrals for fair housing violations. She paused. I can't promise you outcomes because I don't control the courts or the regulatory agencies. But I can tell you I'm not managing a narrative. I'm trying to fix something. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I'll send you the documentation, she said, but I want regular updates, not through your people, through you. Okay. I mean it. I know you do. Okay. After she stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she texted Marcus and told him to clear her Tuesday afternoon. Landon found out about the press coverage the same way he found out about most things happening in the wider world. From a coworker who saw it on his phone on break and held it up across the lunch table with the expression of someone who's realized they know someone adjacent to something notable. Isn't this the Sterling Group thing? His coworker said. Greystone Meridian? He looked up. Wasn't Greystone the company that... Yeah, Landon said. Are you involved in this? Peripherally. That's not what peripherally means. Eat your lunch, Gary. He read the articles that afternoon, sitting in his truck on break. He read them carefully and without the reaction people might have expected, because he'd known the shape of it since Victoria had laid the documents on Kowalski's desk. Seeing it in a newspaper didn't make it more real. It had been real since February when a pipe burst through his ceiling at 2 a.m. and someone filed a noise complaint 6 hours later. What the newspaper coverage did was change the texture of the next 2 weeks in ways he was unprepared for. His building manager, Carl, knocked on his door on Sunday evening, looking both uncomfortable and relieved, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just been told he could put it down. Carl told him that 3 other residents in the building had received similar documentation in the past year. Unexplained code violation reports, a lease non-renewal notice that had been reversed after the tenant complained, one incident that sounded exactly like what had happened to Landon in terms of a third-party complaint filed after a maintenance failure. Carl had kept records of all of it because Carl was, it turned out, meticulous in ways that hadn't been visible until they mattered. I didn't know what I was looking at, Carl said. I knew it felt wrong, but I didn't know it was connected. I know, Landon said. Can you write it down? All of it, with dates? Already did, Carl said, and handed him a folder. He texted Victoria that night. My building manager has records going back 14 months. You should have Kowalski call him. Her response came 11 minutes later. Already in the plan. Kowalski reached out to him Tuesday. Carl's thorough. He stared at that for a second. Then, you already talked to Carl. Kowalski did. I asked him to. A pause. Is that overstepping? He thought about it honestly. 3 weeks ago it would have been. Now it just felt like someone doing the work. No, he wrote. It's good. The custody hearing was set for a Tuesday, 3.5 weeks after Kowalski's office meeting, and the 2 weeks leading up to it were the kind of period that Landon would not remember clearly because he ran on adrenaline and inadequate sleep, and the stubborn refusal to show Mia that anything was wrong. He succeeded at that last part. Or he thought he did. Mia knew something was happening. She was perceptive in the way kids are when they've learned to read the adults around them as a survival skill. But she didn't know the specifics, and he'd made sure of that. Her world stayed intact. School, Mrs. Okafor's plantains, her drawing collection, the dinosaur encyclopedia on her bedside table that she'd read cover to cover twice and was now using as a reference for arguments. Victoria came to the apartment twice more in those 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just present, the way people are present when they've decided to be. She brought takeout the first time because Landon had mentioned in passing that he hadn't eaten a real meal since Tuesday, and she'd apparently filed that information and acted on it. She sat at his kitchen table and ate pad thai, while Mia showed her a new drawing. The Stegosaurus accountant had been joined by a Brachiosaurus lawyer, which Mia said was more realistic about how dinosaurs would probably do. And Landon had watched them and felt the particular complicated feeling of a life that was rearranging itself without asking permission. The second time she came because he'd called her. He'd called her at 10:30 at night, which was not something he planned to do, and which he'd sat with his phone for 20 minutes before doing. He told her he was fine. He told her the case was in good shape. He told her Kowalski was confident, and then he'd run out of true things to say and had been quiet for a moment, and she'd said, "What is it actually?" "I'm scared," he said. It came out flat and factual, the way he said things when he'd stripped the option to say them any other way. "I know the case is solid. I know the documentation is there. I know Kowalski is good. And I'm still sitting here at 10:30 at night scared that some judge is going to look at a spreadsheet and decide my daughter is better off somewhere else." "That's not going to happen," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she said. "I don't. But I know you're the right person to have her. And I know the people in that courtroom are going to know it too, because you can't spend 5 minutes around you and Mia and not know it." He didn't say anything. "That's not optimism," she said. I don't do optimism as a strategy. That's just what I've seen." He sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay." A pause. "Do you need company or do you need quiet?" "Company," he said, before he'd fully decided to say it. She came over. She brought nothing except herself and a jacket because it was cold, and she sat on the other end of his couch, and they watched something on television that neither of them tracked, and Mia was asleep down the hall, and the city was outside doing what cities do. He fell asleep on the couch somewhere around midnight, and when he woke up at 2, she was still there, also asleep, her head tilted to the side and her hair half fallen the way it did. And he sat with that for a moment in the dark and quiet apartment before he went to bed. He didn't say anything about it the next morning, neither did she. Some things don't need to be talked about to be real. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom on West Washington that smelled like institutional cleaning products and old wood. Landon wore the only suit he owned, which was a navy blue one he'd bought for his brother's wedding 4 years ago, and which still fit, but had a small mark on the lapel that he'd covered with a pocket square borrowed from Kowalski. Victoria was there. He hadn't asked her to come. She'd texted him at 7:30 that morning, "I'll be there if that's okay." He'd written back, "Yes." She sat in the gallery, not at the table, and she was dressed in a way that was deliberately understated. Dark blazer, minimal jewelry, the presentation of someone who was there as a person and not a statement. He noticed that and was grateful for it. The opposing counsel was a man named Beckett, who had the smooth, slightly aggressive energy of an attorney who was used to the filings he prepared not being challenged in this kind of detail. He'd clearly not expected Kowalski to walk in with the documentation chain they had, and the first 30 minutes of the hearing had a quality of controlled recalibration on Beckett's side that Landon recognized from construction sites when someone discovered the measurements were off. Kowalski presented the evidence that the financial records had been improperly sourced from lease application data. He presented Carl's 14 months of building records, demonstrating a pattern of third-party complaints following maintenance failures. He presented the 12 photographs of the pipe burst with timestamps. He presented a brief from Victoria's outside counsel establishing the corporate chain between Beckett's client entity and Meridian Realty Partners, and by extension, Harlan Capital Management, and noted that the principal investor in that chain had recently resigned from the board of Sterling Group amid a formal governance investigation. Beckett objected 3 times. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Judge Calloway, who had the expression of someone who had seen most things and maintained a strict policy of not being surprised, overruled twice and asked a clarifying question on the third. The clarifying question was about the custody filing's originating entity. Kowalski had the answer prepared and delivered it with the complete corporate chain, printed, tabbed, submitted as an exhibit. Judge Calloway read it. She read it for a while, which was the kind of reading that meant she was actually reading it, not scanning. Then she looked at Beckett. "Counsel," she said, "your client's filing entity is 3 ownership layers below a company that is currently the subject of a federal governance investigation. The documentation submitted in support of this motion has sourcing issues that you have been unable to address to this court's satisfaction. And the originating complaint in the original record, she glanced at the page, was filed 6 hours after a pipe burst that your opposing counsel has documented in 12 time-stamped photographs. She set the papers down. Would you like to walk me through why this motion should not be dismissed with prejudice? Beckett said several things. None of them were the right things. Landon sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface and watched the judge. And he was very still, the way he went still when he didn't want anyone to see what was happening inside him. Judge Calloway dismissed the custody motion with prejudice and issued a formal notation that the filing appeared to have been made for purposes other than the welfare of the minor child. She referred the matter to the court's administrative office for further review of how the originating documentation had been obtained. Then she looked at Landon directly. Judges didn't always do that. She did. Mr. Hayes, she said, your daughter's custody arrangement remains unchanged. You're free to go. He nodded. He said, Thank you, Your Honor. His voice came out level, which was something he was proud of for the rest of the day. Outside the courtroom, in the corridor, Kowalski shook his hand and said something about the strength of the documentation, and Landon heard it and filed it away because he was having trouble tracking things that weren't the specific fact that it was over. That this particular thing, at least, was over. He turned and found Victoria standing a few feet away. She had her arms crossed in front of her, not closed off, just a habit she had when she was containing something, and her eyes were bright in a way that was different from her usual composure. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. He crossed the space between them and put his arms around her, which was not something he'd planned, and not something he'd have predicted himself doing in a courthouse corridor with Kowalski standing 3 feet away. She was still for a fraction of a second, the reflex of someone who was not often held, and then she wasn't still at all. She put her arms around him and held on with the unceremonious directness of someone who had been maintaining composure for 3 weeks and could finally stop. They stood there for a moment in a courthouse corridor that smelled like cleaning products and old wood, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Kowalski looked at the ceiling with professional interest. That evening, Landon picked Mia up from Mrs. Okafor's with the easy lightness of someone who'd put down something heavy and hadn't fully adjusted to the new weight of his arms yet. Mia, who had spent the day eating plantains and finishing the dinosaur encyclopedia, looked at her father's face in the elevator and said, "Did it go okay?" "It went okay," he said. She nodded like she'd expected this, which she probably had. "I told Mrs. Okafor's TV channel that dinosaurs could solve most problems if you gave them enough time," she said. "She said that was an interesting theory. What did you think about that?" "I think I'm probably right," Mia said, "but I need more data." He put his hand on top of her head and she let him, which she only did when she was tired or when she understood, in her own way, that he needed it. He thought about Victoria, who was somewhere across the city right now dealing with the next phase of the board fallout. The regulatory referrals, the media cycle, the long, slow work of dismantling a thing that had been built wrong. He thought about how she'd looked in the courthouse corridor, holding on with both arms like she meant it. He thought about what it meant to build something that stood up. He thought he was beginning to understand that it wasn't always about steel and concrete. The weeks after the hearing moved differently than the weeks before it. Before, time had a quality of compression, everything pressing in from multiple directions at once. Every day front-loaded with things that needed to happen before other things could happen. Landon had lived inside that compression for so long that he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic when you live near a highway. It was just the texture of his life. After the hearing, the compression eased. Not all at once, not dramatically, just the gradual way that a thing you've been bracing against stops pushing, and you feel for the first time in a while the actual weight of your own body. He went back to the Wicker Park site on Wednesday. He worked. The building was coming along, so third-floor framing was nearly complete, and there was something satisfying about that, the way a structure that had been open scaffolding and rough columns was becoming something with interior logic, rooms beginning to be rooms, hallways beginning to be hallways. He thought about what he'd told Victoria in the laundromat about buildings that stayed, and felt the truth of it differently now. Not everything you put in the world stands up. Some things get pulled apart by forces that have nothing to do with how well you built them. But you kept building anyway, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was the only guaranteed way to end up with nothing. Mia went back to school on Thursday with the Stegosaurus Encyclopedia in her bag because she decided her teacher needed to understand something about therapsid evolution and was prepared to facilitate that. Landon dropped her off and watched her walk through the school doors with the particular Mia stride, slightly too fast, slightly purposeful, like she had places to be and had always had places to be, and felt the ordinary, extraordinary thing of a normal morning. Victoria called that afternoon. Not a text. An actual call, which was still slightly unusual between them, not because they hadn't talked, but because their communication had developed its own rhythm of texts and occasional long late-night calls, and the 2 in-person visits that had happened without much planning and meant something neither of them had put words to yet. "How's the site?" she asked. "Good, 3rd floor's coming." He was sitting in his truck on lunch break. "How's your end?" Her end was complicated and ongoing. The governance investigation had formally referred Harlan's undisclosed conflicts to the state securities regulator, which meant it had moved out of internal process into actual regulatory territory. The fair housing referrals, Victoria's attorneys had worked with Patricia Osei's tenant documentation and submitted a comprehensive complaint covering the systematic displacement pattern across 9 of Meridian's 14 properties, were moving through the review process at the State Housing Authority. Greystone's property management arm had quietly ceased operations in 3 of the affected buildings, which Landon had read about in a brief online item, and which Victoria had confirmed was them getting ahead of the regulatory exposure. Falk had resigned, as expected. 2 of the 3 Meridian principals had retained criminal defense counsel, which was the kind of move that communicated something specific about what they thought was coming. Harlan had given a statement to the financial press that used the phrase good faith business practices 4 times in 6 sentences, which Victoria's communications director had described as the verbal equivalent of running in place. "The housing authority complaint is going to take time," Victoria said. "Months, probably. But Patricia Osei has been incredible. Her documentation goes back further than anything we had, and she's got tenant testimony that gives it a human weight that pure corporate records don't." "How is she?" "Tired. Very competent. She told me last week that she'd been fighting versions of this for 20 years, and she was glad someone with resources had finally decided to pay attention." A pause. She said it nicely. The "finally" was doing a lot of work, though. "She's not wrong." "No," Victoria said, "she's not." There was a quality in her voice that he'd learned to recognize over the past few weeks, a particular honesty she allowed herself in private that she kept more contained in the professional context where she spent most of her time. It was the same quality he'd heard in the laundromat when she'd said, "I needed to be somewhere that nobody was looking at me." I keep thinking about what she said, that she'd been fighting versions of this for 20 years. That means 20 years of the same thing happening to different people in different buildings, and all those people just absorbed the cost of it, lost their apartments, moved their kids to different schools, started over. She paused. "And we only found it because a memo ended up in a file it shouldn't have been in." "You would have found it eventually," Landon said. "Maybe. Maybe not." Another pause. "I killed the Lakeview deal, and I felt good about that. I thought I'd done the right thing, and the right thing turned out to be a floor with nothing underneath it. You're fixing it now." "I'm fixing what I can reach," she said. "That's not the same thing." He didn't argue with her on that because she was right, and he knew she knew the difference. There are things you fix, and there are things you can't undo. And living with that distinction was something she was going to be working out for a while. He understood that because he had his own version of it, things he'd done right, and things that had gone wrong anyway, and the ongoing project of not letting the second category swallow the first. "Mia asked about you this morning," he said. "What did she ask?" "She wanted to know if you'd found out more about therapsids." He paused. "I told her probably not since Saturday." "She would be right to want an update," Victoria said. "I've been doing some reading." He smiled before he could not smile. "Of course you have." "There's an argument to be made that the cynodonts are underrepresented in popular dinosaur discourse." "Is there?" "Strong argument. I have sources." "I'll tell Mia. She'll want a formal presentation." "I can do a formal presentation." "I know you can," he said. "That's what I'm worried about." She laughed. The real one, not the social one, the one that came out fast and surprised her every time. He'd learned to wait for it the way you wait for something good that you've started to expect but don't want to take for granted. I'll come in by Saturday, she said. If that still works? That still works. 4 months moved through in the way that months move when you're inside a life that's being rebuilt. Not smoothly, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that turn out to matter more than the big ones. The regulatory process ground forward on its own timeline, which was slow and bureaucratic and necessary and occasionally maddening. The Housing Authority investigation was expanded in January to cover 12 of the 14 Meridian properties after Patricia Osei's testimony introduced a volume of documentation that the investigators had not anticipated. Greystone Development's leadership, Gerald Webb, and 2 other principals were notified in February that they were subjects of a criminal referral to the State Attorney General's office for wire fraud related to the family court filings. That specific referral, the one that came directly from the family court's administrative review of the Hayes custody motion, was the one that had the clearest chain of documented evidence and the most direct human cost attached to it. Landon's attorney, Dan Kowalski, testified before the Housing Authority in March. He'd been careful, thorough, and according to Patricia Osei afterward, more useful than 3 of the other attorneys who testified combined, mostly because he had a gift for saying complicated things in language that didn't require translation. Richard Harlan settled with the state securities regulator in February without admitting wrongdoing, which was the legal equivalent of paying for the broken window while maintaining that windows just broke sometimes. The settlement required him to divest his interest in Meridian and pay a fine that was large enough to be reported in the financial press and small enough that it probably wasn't large enough. Victoria had said that privately and without satisfaction, which was how she said most of the true things she said. You did what you could reach, and you lived with the rest. Sterling Group's board had been restructured by then, 2 new independent members replacing Harlan and Falk. The governance procedures tightened in ways that would make the next version of this harder to run from inside. Victoria had driven that process personally, and it had taken the better part of 3 months of internal work that nobody outside the company was going to notice or credit. But that was the kind of work that mattered in the long run precisely because it was invisible. She'd told Landon one evening in his kitchen while Mia was asleep, and the 2 of them were at the table with the remains of dinner between them and the easy quiet of people who had stopped performing comfort around each other. Nobody's going to write about the governance restructure, she said. They'll write about the scandal, about Harlan, about the housing investigation. The boring preventive work doesn't make the story. Does it bother you? He asked. She thought about it honestly, which was a thing she did with him that she didn't do in every room. A little. Not because I want the credit, more because the boring work is actually the thing that matters and it's invisible by design, which means the next version of this can happen somewhere else, and the story becomes about the scandal again instead of about why the prevention failed. You can't control that, he said. No. You can only build the thing and hope it stands. She looked at him across the table. The kitchen light was not flattering. It never was. It was a cheap overhead fixture that he kept meaning to replace. And she looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been working hard on something important for a long time. She looked real, was the word he'd use if he were describing it to someone, which he wouldn't be, but that was the word. Just real. Just a person at a table after dinner, tired and thinking, without the 42-floor presentation that the world mostly saw. Yes, she said. You build the thing and hope it stands. The media attention peaked in late November and tapered through January. There was a long piece in a national magazine in December that ran with a photograph of Victoria at her desk and described her as the billionaire CEO who torpedoed her own board to fight for a single family's custody rights, which was reductive in multiple directions but was also the kind of sentence that traveled. She'd read it, said, that's not accurate in 4 specific ways, and moved on. Her communications director had been thrilled about it. She let him be thrilled. What the article missed, what all of them missed, because it was not visible from the outside, was the texture of the 4 months. Not the headline sequence of scandal and resignation and regulatory referral, but the Saturday afternoons in Landon's apartment, Mia on the floor with her drawings and her running narration, Victoria on the couch with her reading glasses on, and documents she was working through, Landon in the kitchen making something that was not quite a meal but was food, The three of them in the same space doing separate things the way people do when they're comfortable enough to not be entertaining each other. Not every afternoon was good. Some were complicated in the ways that real things are complicated. There was an evening in December when Landon came home from a long day on a difficult site and was in a mood that had nothing to do with Victoria, and she hadn't read it right and had pushed on something she should have left alone. And there'd been a conversation that went sideways for about 20 minutes before they'd both recalibrated and gotten honest about what was actually happening. "I do this thing," he said, in the aftermath of that conversation, both of them at the kitchen table again, the reliable site of their most direct conversations, where I go quiet and expect people to understand that I need space without saying I need space. It's not fair, and I know I do it. "I do a thing where I treat silence as a problem to solve," she said. "When someone goes quiet, I start trying to fix the quiet instead of waiting." "That's us, then." "That's us." She looked at her coffee cup. "We're both going to keep doing it. Probably. But we can do it less," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We can do it less." That was the version of them that existed when nobody was writing magazine articles. Two people who were figuring something out, making the ordinary mistakes that people make, doing the work of being honest with each other in the specific areas where honesty was hard. It wasn't seamless. It was better than seamless. Seamless was a surface. This had depth. Mia, for her part, had developed opinions. She told Mrs. Okafor in November that Victoria was good at listening, which is unusual for adults. She told her teacher in December that her family was reconfiguring, which was a word she'd heard Victoria use in a different context and had apparently filed. She told Landon one evening in January, with the directness of a person who had decided something and saw no reason not to announce it, "I think we should keep her." Landon had been making dinner. He'd set down the spatula. "Where did that come from?" "I've been thinking about it," Mia said. She was at the kitchen table with the Therapsid encyclopedia, which she returned to periodically the way you return to a book you've decided is a reference text. "She brought me a book." She learned about synodonts. "She fixed your mood that one time in December." "She didn't fix my—" "You were in a bad mood and she said something and then you weren't," Mia said, with the tone of someone presenting evidence. "That's fixing." Landon looked at his daughter for a moment. She was 8 years and almost 9, nearly 9, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her own particular quality of attention that was entirely hers. This way of looking at things as if she was going to understand them, whether they wanted to be understood or not. "I'll take it under consideration," he said. "You should," Mia said, and went back to the synodonts. The evening of the proposal was in March, 7 months after the laundromat. It wasn't planned in the conventional sense of planned. There was no elaborate setup, no restaurant reservation, no coordinated logistics. Landon was not, by nature or by circumstance, a person who coordinated elaborate logistics. What he was, after 32 years and a lot of things going wrong and a few things going right, and one night in a laundromat that had changed the structure of everything after it, was a person who recognized true things when he was inside them. He'd had the ring for 3 weeks. It wasn't an extravagant ring, a simple setting, clean and plain, the kind of thing that would sit on a hand without announcing itself constantly. He'd bought it on a lunch break, which was not a romantic origin story but was an honest one. He'd been walking past a small jewelry shop on Damon and had looked in the window and had known, with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who has stopped arguing with himself about things that are already decided, that he was going to go in. He'd carried it in the inside pocket of his jacket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and then one evening in March he realized that the waiting for the right moment was its own kind of stalling, and that the right moment was not a category of event that arrived from outside. It was a thing you made by deciding that now, specifically now, was when you were going to say the true thing. He'd suggested going to the laundromat. Victoria had looked at him across the kitchen table with the expression of a person who was receiving information and processing it. The laundromat. Clark Street Wash. On a Wednesday evening. "Mia's at Mrs. Okafor's." He paused. "I've got laundry that needs doing." She looked at him for a moment longer. Something in her expression shifted. Not suspicion, more like the careful attention of someone who had learned to read him and was reading. "Okay," she said. But Clark Street Wash at 7:30 on a Wednesday in March was almost exactly as it had been in October, slightly different clientele. A young couple at the far end, a teenager doing what appeared to be an entire semester's worth of laundry all at once. But the same flickering fluorescence, the same scuffed tiles, the same vending machine with the hand-lettered warning about pressing gently. Landon loaded the washer. He'd brought actual laundry, because that was honest, and because the machines needed quarters regardless of what else was happening. Victoria sat in the plastic chairs and watched him with the particular attention she gave things she was trying to understand. "The E4 machine is still here," she said, looking at the front-load washer in the corner. "Carl told me they ordered a part in December," Landon said. "It hasn't arrived." "That tracks." He finished loading, put the quarters in, started the cycle. He sat down in the chair across from her. The machines hummed. Outside on Milwaukee Avenue, the city moved through its ordinary Wednesday evening. Traffic, a bus, a couple walking fast against the wind. They sat in the same positions they'd sat in 7 months ago, and it was different in every way and exactly the same in the way that mattered, which was that they were two people in a room choosing to be honest with each other. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know? You've been carrying something in your jacket for 3 weeks," she said. "You keep touching the pocket when you think I'm not looking." She held his gaze, and her expression had the warmth she kept mostly private, the version of her that wasn't the 42-floor presentation. "I've been waiting for you to decide it was time." He looked at her for a moment, then he laughed, short and genuine, the kind of laugh that comes when something is exactly true. "Of course you noticed. I read everything," she said. "That's what I do." He reached into his jacket and took out the ring. He held it in his hand. No box, just the ring, plain and simple and real, the way he'd been carrying it. He looked at it for a second and then looked at her. "I've been trying to figure out what to say," he said. "I had something prepared and it was too much. It was the version you say when you're trying to say it right instead of saying it true." He paused. "So here's true. You walked into this laundromat 7 months ago, and you sat down across from me, and you talked to me like a person. Not like a project, not like a situation, like a person." He turned the ring in his fingers. "And I've spent most of my adult life being strong for someone else, which I don't regret, not for a second. But I forgot somewhere along the way that being strong for someone else and being known by someone are different things. You're the first person in a long time who's made me feel like both were possible at the same time." Victoria was very still. Her eyes were bright, and she wasn't blinking, and she was doing the things she did when she was containing something, arms slightly crossed, very upright. But it wasn't closed off. It was the opposite. It was someone trying to hold something carefully because it mattered. "Mia thinks we should keep you," he said, "and I think she's right. I think you're the missing piece we didn't know we had the shape of until you showed up." He held out the ring. Not on one knee. He was sitting in a plastic laundromat chair, and it was a Wednesday, and there were strangers 12 feet away, and that was fine. That was exactly right. That was them. "So, will you stay?" Victoria looked at him, and looked at the ring, and looked at him again. Her jaw was tight in the way it got when she was trying not to let something visible happen to her face. "That's the proposal?" she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Will you stay?" "That's the one. Not will you marry me?" "I figured stay covered it." He paused. "Does it not cover it?" She exhaled, and it was the breath of someone releasing 3 weeks and 7 months and several years of learned carefulness in one go. She reached across and took the ring from his hand and held it in her palm, and looked at it, small and plain and without ceremony, exactly like the man who'd bought it. And then she looked at him. "It covers it," she said. She put it on herself because she was Victoria Sterling, and she was not going to wait for someone else to do something she could do. And she looked at it on her hand for a moment, and then she looked back at him, and her face was completely open. No presentation, no composure, just her. The person underneath the 42 floors, and the board meetings, and the decade of being the one that other people needed to adjust around. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." The teenager at the far end of the laundromat looked up from his giant pile of laundry, clocked what was happening, looked back down, and said nothing, which was perfect laundromat etiquette. Landon leaned forward and kissed her, in the plastic chairs, in the flickering fluorescent light, with the washers humming and the city going about its Wednesday outside. It was not a cinematic moment by anyone's professional definition. There was no music, the lighting was genuinely bad. His laundry still had 20 minutes on the cycle. It was the truest moment of his adult life. Later, much later, after the laundry was done and folded, and they'd picked up Mia from Mrs. Okafor's, and Mia had looked at Victoria's hand and said, "I told him to," with the satisfaction of a person whose strategic advice had been correctly followed. Victoria sat on the edge of Mia's bed while Landon was in the kitchen, and Mia was doing the thing she did before sleep where she had one more thought she needed to say. "Are you scared?" Mia asked. Victoria looked at her. The bedside lamp was on, and Mia was under her covers with the Therapsid encyclopedia on the pillow beside her like a companion animal, her dark eyes direct and serious in the way they got when she'd decided something was worth asking. "A little," Victoria said. "That's okay," Mia said. "My dad was scared the whole time he was building the thing in Wicker Park, and it still stood up." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Did he tell you that?" "No," Mia said, "but I could tell." She adjusted the encyclopedia on the pillow. "I can tell when adults are scared. They get very still and quiet, and they keep doing things anyway." She looked at Victoria. "You did that too. The whole time with the board stuff and the lawyers and everything. You were scared and you kept doing things." "I wasn't sure it showed." "It showed to me," Mia said, without judgment. "But it was the good kind of scared. Mrs. Okafor says there's a good kind and a bad kind. The bad kind makes you stop. The good kind makes you careful." Victoria sat with that for a moment, in the lamp-lit room with the Therapsid encyclopedia and the drawings on the wall and the small, serious person under the covers, who was almost 9 and already understood something. It had taken Victoria 30 years to get close to. "Your dad is lucky to have you," she said. "I know," Mia said simply. "But I'm lucky too." She paused. "We're both lucky now. All three." Victoria leaned forward and kissed Mia's forehead, and Mia accepted this with the dignity of someone who had decided to allow it, which was Mia's version of affection, and which Victoria had come to understand and be grateful for. She turned off the lamp and closed the door most of the way and stood in the hallway for a moment. There is a thing that happens when you have spent so long being competent in the large sense, managing the visible things, the board meetings and the quarterly results, and the public narrative and the reputation that has to be maintained like infrastructure, that you can go years without fully living in the small sense. Years where the texture of your actual life is thin, because everything real has been redirected into the performance of capability. Years where you eat alone at restaurants that are impressive and sleep in apartments that are correct and measure your days in outcomes and decisions and moves made well or poorly. Victoria had not known how thin it had gotten until she sat in a plastic chair in a failing laundromat at midnight and talked to a man who spoke about his work as if the things he built were worth caring about, and laughed at a sick 8-year-old's observation about a hamster, and didn't ask her for anything. That was the thing she'd known right away without having the language for it yet. He hadn't wanted anything from her, not the money, not the access, not the reflected status. He talked to her like she was the person in the chair across from him, and nothing else, and she hadn't realized how long it had been since that had happened until she felt it. You don't always know what you need until someone offers it without knowing they're offering. Passat. Landon was in the kitchen washing the dishes from dinner when she came back in. He was standing at the sink with his sleeves pushed up, doing the ordinary task with the ordinary competence of someone who had done it 10,000 times. And he looked up when she came in, and his expression was the quiet one, the not performing one, just him. "She's down?" he said. "Asleep before I closed the door." Victoria leaned against the counter. "She told me that scared and careful are the same thing." Landon kept washing. "She got that from Mrs. Okafor. It's good regardless of the source." "Yeah." He rinsed a plate and set it in the rack. "She's been processing things her whole life that I can barely articulate. I don't know where she gets it." "She gets it from watching you," Victoria said. He looked at her. "She watches how you handle things," Victoria said. "Not what you say. How you act when it's hard. Kids learn from the model, not the instruction." She paused. "You've been a good model." He turned back to the sink. She could see his shoulders shift slightly, the micro-adjustment of a man who had been told something true and was accepting it without deflecting it away, which was something he'd gotten better at over the past few months, and which she'd noticed without mentioning. "We should probably talk about the practical things," he said. "At some point, living situation, timing." "Yes," she said, "not tonight. Definitely not tonight." He finished the last dish and dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around. The kitchen light was still bad. She'd been meaning to ask if he wanted to replace the fixture and had kept not asking because it felt like a line she wasn't sure about crossing. She looked at the fixture now. "You can replace the light," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "You keep looking at the overhead light like you're deciding something. You can replace it if it bothers you." "I was being careful about, it's your apartment. It's going to be ours," he said, simply, not making a big thing of it. "You can replace the light." She looked at the light again, then at him. "It's really bad." "It's terrible," he agreed. "I'll find something better. Something that doesn't make everyone look like they have the flu." "That's a low bar." "It's the bar we're working with." She laughed, and it was the real one, the fast, surprised one. And he was smiling, not the careful, controlled version, but the full one. And the kitchen was badly lit, and there were dishes in the drying rack, and outside on Milwaukee Avenue the city was a city, just going on being what it was. This is what it actually is, she thought. Not the magazine story, not the board meeting victory, not the headline about the billionaire CEO who risked her empire. It's this. A kitchen light that needs replacing. A man drying his hands on a dish towel. A child asleep down the hall who told you you're lucky and meant it with her whole body. This is the thing that stays. There are stories people tell about money and power and the ways the world is arranged to protect them. Those stories are mostly true, which is what makes them useful and what makes them limited at the same time. They tell you about force and structure and the way leverage works. They don't tell you what happens inside the force field, in the apartments, and the kitchens, and the laundromats where people are just trying to get through a Wednesday. What Victoria Sterling would say, later, when people asked her what she had risked and why. And people did ask, journalists and board members and the occasional person at a function who'd read the magazine piece and wanted the version that made sense as a lesson, was something that usually disappointed them in its plainness. She would say, "I met someone who was doing the right thing with what he had. And I realized I'd been doing the right thing with what I had, up to a point, and stopping before the point where it got difficult. And once I saw the gap between those two things, I couldn't unsee it." That was the version she gave publicly. It was true as far as it went. The fuller version, the one she kept, was simpler and harder to fit into a lesson. It was about sitting in a plastic chair at midnight in a broken laundromat and feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the person in the room rather than the position. It was about a man who made medicine for his sick daughter the priority over an overdue bill without making it a virtue, just making it a fact, just doing it because it was obviously the thing to do. It was about watching someone carry something heavy with the quiet intention of a person who has decided that putting it down is not an option, and recognizing in that something she wanted to be closer to. You can build a life that is entirely correct and entirely hollow. You can optimize every external variable and still feel, at 2 in the morning, like you're running a presentation about a person rather than being one. Victoria had been doing that for longer than she'd admitted, and the admission, when it finally came, slowly, over the course of months and laundromats and difficult board meetings and courthouse corridors and badly lit kitchen conversations, was not a crisis. It was a relief. The relief of a building that has been waiting for its final structural element and finally has it placed. Landon Hayes had spent 3 years being strong for someone else and had forgotten, or set aside, the question of what he needed. Not because he was self-sacrificing in a sentimental way. He would have objected to that framing and not been wrong to, but because survival had required his full attention and there hadn't been anything left over for that particular question. The question of what he needed had been a luxury he couldn't afford. He would say later, not publicly, but in the way people say things in kitchens after the world has gone quiet, that the most surprising thing about Victoria was not her intelligence or her competence, or even the decision she'd made to burn her board situation down to protect a family she barely knew. The most surprising thing was how much she was paying attention, to the things he said and the things he didn't say, to Mia's drawings and the quality of her jokes and the specific way she processed things, to the light fixtures, to the axle on his truck, which Victoria had mentioned once in passing needed to be looked at and which she'd arranged quietly, without announcement, to be seen by a mechanic she knew, and which had cost him nothing, and about which he'd felt briefly and genuinely complicated until he'd realized that this was just how she operated. She saw a problem and she moved toward it, not because she needed to demonstrate something, but because moving toward problems was simply her nature. They were, in the ways that mattered, very similar. Both of them oriented toward the work rather than the recognition. Both of them better at doing than at receiving. Both of them carrying things they'd gotten so used to carrying that they'd forgotten to put them down when someone offered to help carry. The shared custody of all of that. That was the relationship. Not the laundromat meeting, not the board confrontation, not the courthouse corridor. The daily negotiation of two people who had each built strong walls, deciding, slowly and somewhat clumsily and not without wrong turns, to let the other one actually in. Mia navigated this with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who had learned early that families came in the shapes they came in, and the shape was less important than the quality of the care inside it. She added Victoria to her world the way she added new information to her encyclopedic knowledge of prehistoric mammals, with interest, with questions, with the occasional formal presentation, and then with the easy incorporation that meant it had become part of how she understood things. By summer, she had stopped introducing Victoria to people as my dad's girlfriend. She had started, without announcement, saying my family in the inclusive way that meant all three of them. The first time Landon heard her do it, in a conversation with a school friend, casual, as if it had always been true. He'd had to find a reason to be in another room for a minute. Some things you don't deserve, you just receive, and you spend the rest of your life being worth them. On a Friday evening in June, Landon drove past the building on North Clark. He did this sometimes, not as a ritual, not as a sentimental practice, just as a thing that happened when he was going that direction and had a minute to look. The building was 5 years old now, 6 this fall. It was mid-rise commercial, nothing architecturally notable, the kind of building that blended into a city block without demanding attention. But it was straight and solid, and the cladding had weathered well, and the foundation work, which Landon had been part of at the very beginning, had been done right. It was still there. He thought about what he'd told Victoria in the laundromat, about the quality of building things that stayed. He thought about what she'd said in response. That's not how most people think about their work. And the way she'd said it, like he'd shown her something in a window she'd been walking past for years without looking in. I thought about everything that had been built in the 8 months since that night. The legal case, piece by careful piece, the board restructure, the housing complaint that was working through its process, the small daily architecture of a life with 3 people in it, the Saturday afternoons, the badly lit kitchen, the dinosaur encyclopedia on the bedside table, the replacement light fixture that Victoria had chosen, and that was genuinely, significantly better. He thought about Mia saying the good kind of scared makes you careful. He drove home. Victoria was already there. She had a key, had had one since February, and used it with the same unpretentious practicality she brought to everything, just a person arriving at a place she belonged. She was in the kitchen with the mail and a coffee, reading something with her reading glasses on, and she looked up when he came in and said, "There's food," and pointed at the stove. He hung up his jacket and went to the stove and lifted the lid, and there was actual food, real food, something she'd made that smelled like it involved garlic and effort, and the cookbook she'd bought in March that she was working her way through with the methodical ambition she brought to new projects. "How's it look?" she asked, without looking up from her reading. "Good," he said. "I may have overcooked the garlic." "A little." "How much is a little?" He looked at the pan. "It's fine." "That's not what I asked." "It's fine and we'll eat it and it'll be good," he said. "Stop reading and come eat." She took off her reading glasses and set the mail down and came to the kitchen table, and he served the food that was slightly overcooked in one particular way and otherwise very good. And they ate in the easy quiet of people who had gotten past the stage of filling every silence and reached the stage where the silence was also comfortable. Mia came out of her room at some point, as she did, drawn by the smell or the voices or just the instinct of a person who preferred to be where the people were. She looked at the food. She sat down. She ate. "Mrs. Okafor says you should get a dog," she said to both of them equally. "Mrs. Okafor says a lot of things," Landon said. "She's right about most of them," Mia said. She looked at Victoria. "What do you think about dogs?" "I think they're a significant commitment," Victoria said. "That's what people say when they're open to it," Mia said. Victoria looked at Landon. He looked back at her. Something passed between them that was the specific communication of 2 people who have started to share a life and are both thinking the same thing about an 8-year-old who is dramatically more strategic than she should be at this age. We'll discuss it, Landon said. Yes, Mia said with satisfaction, and went back to her food. The kitchen light was better now. It cast everything in a warm, honest light. Not glamorous, not harsh, just real. The table with the ring stain he'd never gotten around to sanding, the chairs that didn't quite match, the window over the sink that looked out on the back alley, where the streetlight flickered sometimes. Everything was still there, still standing. That was enough. That was everything.